Hello, welcome to another PVC sound video. This one's going to cover speech and how we use EQ to tackle problems like feedback, like too much sibilance, so your S's, too many plosives, so your P's and your B's, maybe a lack of clarity in your vocals, and how we can tackle that on speech using EQ. So thankfully at PVC, Pastor Johnny on a headset mic needs very little EQ on his voice. It works pretty well. But the main issues come when people are using the lectern mic, when it's not ideally positioned, or when people are on stage who are maybe not used to being up there and they're using a handheld mic, either too close or too far away, can create problems, which we might not be able to fix the position of the mic at the time, but we can use EQ to help it sound better. Okay, so I think this could be useful for you. You may not have seen a spectrogram before of sound, but we'll have a little look here. Along the y-axis you have frequencies, so your low and your high, and you have your time across the x-axis. And then you have your colors, so your brighter yellows are high energy frequencies. So I'll play this to you.
Sound.
So speech is basically made up of three elements. You have your sibilance, you have your fundamental frequency, and you have your harmonics. So here you can see your sibilance, so that's all your S's.
Sound.
So all around here, this sort of area, from about 3K upwards, is where the S's exist in speech. And then you have your fundamental harmonics. So I'll jump into a note on guitar here to explain this a little bit. So basically you have, this is just one single note played on guitar. And your fundamental note, so it's an A note that was played on guitar, an A string. And this bottom note here is the fundamental. And you need that for it to sound like basically full. But then you have these harmonics which are all stacked above, and you need those for it to sound like a guitar. So if I select all your harmonics and delete them, still sounds like an A at the right pitch, but it doesn't sound like a guitar anymore. And likewise, if I remove the fundamental frequency and maybe the first harmonic, still sounds like an A note, but you've lost that body, that kind of bottom essential note. So it's the exact same with speech, really. Here you can kind of loosely see it when the kind of tonal part of my voice.
Sound.
So that is me essentially producing a note. Here's the fundamental of that note, and then you have your harmonics on top of that, and that's kind of important to know for a little bit later on. Okay, so the first essential technique that we need for speech on EQ is a high-pass filter. So we talked about this in the previous video on EQ. A high-pass filter lets all the high frequencies pass and stops all the low frequencies. Could also be called a low cut. But basically, on any speech, we want to cut everything below the fundamental frequency. So I'll speak into this mic here, and you'll be able to hear and see the frequencies active on this EQ.
1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2.
Okay, so you can see all the low frequencies down here, and we essentially don't need a lot of those. So on a male's voice, the kind of lowest frequencies, fundamental frequencies, would be around 80 hertz. So we can essentially apply a high-pass filter up to 80 there, and that will clean up a lot of mud that we don't need below the fundamental frequency. On female speaking, you can go up to about 165 on the high pass filter, and because obviously they have higher voices, they don't have they have higher fundamental frequencies. So another thing you should be aware of is that cardioid microphones. So cardioid's the pickup pattern, so it's essentially around here. Most of our mics that we use at PBC have cardioid pickup patterns, and they have proximity effect, which basically means that the closer to the mic you get, the more low frequencies you have. So if I turn off my high pass filter and we listen on this mic a second.
So as I'm really close into the mic, you can hear all the low frequencies. And as I get further away, there's less and less low frequencies. And as I come back in again and speak and then turn on my high pass filter, 1, 2, 1, 2, that will get rid of some of those really low frequencies that aren't needed below the fundamental.
Another thing where your high pass filter is really useful is with handling noise. So if I turn this off for a second and handle the mic stand, you can see all those low frequencies as I touch the mic stand, or if I touch a handheld mic. So putting a high pass filter on there should get rid of the majority of the handling noises, which can be really useful for handhelds. Okay, so I'm going to use this EQ within Logic here, which is very similar to the one that we use on PreSonus. And I'll turn on my monitors here and you'll hear some feedback.
1, 2. Turn that a bit. 1, 2, 1, 2. I'll turn this off so that I'm not cheating. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Okay, so I can hear a very prominent frequency poking through there. So basically what I'm going to do is take one of my bands of the EQ. I know it's a lower frequency, I can roughly hear that. We narrow that band using the Q, and then we basically sweep around until that frequency disappears. So
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Sorry, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. There we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2.
okay, so you can hear that low band that I just applied. It gets rid of that kind of low resonance. There's also a high one up there, really quite high, so I'm going to use a higher band and sweep around until I can hear that, until we get rid of that.
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Okay, so that was around 5k, and we've got rid of that. I think there's another one kind of like mid-frequency. We'll sweep around for that one as well. So
1, 2, 1, 2.
turn these up a bit.
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Okay, that sounds good. And I also put my high pass on there at about 80. So we're doing a lot of cuts here, but you'll hear the difference when I turn this.
1, 2, 1, 2.
And totally bypass it.
1, 2. 1, 2.
So still not perfect there, but it's a lot better. Obviously my mic's about a meter from my speakers and it's turned up quite a lot. But we can quite effectively use an EQ to eliminate problematic frequencies like that. Okay, another common issue you get, particularly in our room at PBC, is sibilance. So there seems to be quite a lot of decay, like reverb on the S's. I think especially when the overflows open at the back, because of all the hard surfaces, you get quite a lot of reverb on sibilance. So it can be quite kind of distracting sometimes, so particularly on some people's voices. So A simple way to tackle this on an EQ, if you have a look here, I'll turn this mic on.
1, 2, sibilance, sibilance. So you can see all my S's are very kind of prominent around 5K. So if I grab my EQ here, sibilance, 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 it starts to cut out there. Sometimes you will have to use a wider Q just to get rid of some of that.
You don't want to really use a shelf here and bring down all the high end, because it'll end up sounding very muffled.
Sibilance, it'll become muffled and you won't be able to make out too much of what they're saying.
Okay, so another really common problem we have with vocal mics are plosives. So they're the B's and the P's. So if you put your hand up to your mouth and say B and P, B and P, you can really hear or you can really feel the explosion of air hitting your hand. So it's the same with mics. That's why there's a pop shield here. A lot of mics have built-in pop shields in the grill in an SM58. The headset mic, there is a little wind breaker tip for that that I would encourage you to use, and it's going to be an issue on some people and not so much of an issue on other people, depending who's speaking. But our frequencies that is mainly an issue for the B's and the P's, the plosives, are the really low frequencies. So anything kind of below the fundamental here, you can hear on this
Sound.
So there's a couple of plosives here
Sound.
that are really low. You can see them on the graph, and if I just select those and get rid of them,
Sound.
it's a lot cleaner. So all we need to use is a high pass filter to get rid of those plosives. Sometimes, depending how extreme it is, it can cause a little bit of distortion, and there's not much we can do with that in terms of EQ, but a high pass filter will do most of the work for you. Okay, so another problem you could potentially have is that someone sounds quite nasally. If people have colds, they can sound really nasally, or some people just have that kind of voice. Maybe they're pointing the mic too much up their nose or something, but it can kind of sound like this.
1, 2, 1, 2, sounds quite nasally, sounds a bit like they have a cold. And then we can cut around your kind of mid frequencies here. So if I cut around 400, you can widen that a little bit. 1, 2, 1, 2. If I turn that off, 1, 2, 1, 2, sounds nasally. 1, 2, 1, 2, sounds a lot nicer.
Okay, and the very last thing I'll cover here is clarity. Talked a bit about this technique in the last EQ video, more to do with singing and vocals. But if you want to boost a little bit of clarity, I'll use this mic just so you can hear.
Obviously, the first thing we want to do is high pass filter at about 80 hertz because I'm a guy, so or 85 even's good. So for a bit of extra added clarity, boosting around 2K can really add and help bring out the certain syllables that the person speaking is saying, and should add a bit more intelligibility.
Okay, so that's everything with speech and using EQ to enhance speech. Obviously, speech is a really important part, probably the most important part of the service. The pastor's sermon, the speech that's on stage. It's really important that people can actually hear what's being said. It's not too loud, it's not too quiet, there's not feedback that's distracting, that kind of thing. So hopefully these techniques will help you, yeah, let me know if you have any questions about this stuff. Thanks.